had always been someone who enjoyed being alone. I didn't mind silence, and I didn't need people around me all the time. In fact, I preferred it. So when I had the chance to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a week, I jumped on it. The place was cheap, isolated, and had no Wi-Fi, which was exactly what I wanted. I needed a break from everything. Work, my phone, the constant noise of life. It was just me, a few books, and nature. The drive there took longer than I expected. The GPS signal cut out miles before I even reached the turnoff, and I had to rely on the printed directions I had brought with me. The road was rough, more like an overgrown trail than an actual road, but my truck managed it. It was mid-afternoon when I finally pulled up to the cabin. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-room cabin with a kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and a bedroom separated by a thin wooden wall. There was a fireplace, an old gas stove, and a single window facing the tree line. It smelled like wood and dust, like no one had been there for a while. That was fine with me. The first day went by peacefully. I unpacked, made myself a simple meal, and sat on the small porch, watching the sun go down. The trees stretched tall and dense around me, and the quiet was almost overwhelming. No cars, no voices, just the wind in the branches and the occasional sound of an animal moving through the brush. It was perfect. The first night, I slept better than I had in months. The bed was old, the mattress stiff, but I was exhausted from the drive and the fresh air. I woke up once in the middle of the night, not sure why, but after a few minutes of listening to the wind outside, I went back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore a bit. There wasn't much around except trees, but I found an old, narrow path behind the cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curious, I followed it for about half a mile before I came across something strange. An old, abandoned fire pit, surrounded by broken bottles and rusted cans. There was something unsettling about it. It felt wrong, like whoever had been here hadn't left in a hurry, but had left something unfinished. I shook off the feeling and went back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed without anything unusual. I read, cooked, sat by the fire. The quiet was peaceful, but it also felt heavy, like the woods were too still, like they were listening. That night, I woke up again. This time, I knew why. There was a sound outside, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves, like footsteps. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. For a long time, I lay there, waiting. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but I didn't sleep much after that. The third day, I found more strange things. Not far from the cabin, I saw what looked like scratches on a tree trunk. They weren't made by an animal. The marks were deep, jagged, too high up for any normal creature to make. They looked deliberate, like someone had taken a knife and dug it into the bark. That evening, as the sun went down, I got an uneasy feeling. The air felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked into the trees, there was nothing there, but it felt like something was there, just out of sight. I double-checked the cabin door before going to bed. It had an old lock, not the strongest, but I figured it was good enough. That night, I woke up again. This time, it was worse. The footsteps were back, slow and steady, moving around the cabin. Not in a straight line, but circling. I sat up, barely breathing. Then came the tapping. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the wall. Not the window, not the door, the wooden wall of the cabin. I didn't move. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? The wind? No, it was too precise, too deliberate. Then it stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like forever. My chest ached from holding my breath. Finally, after what felt like hours, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I went outside the moment the sun was up, searching for tracks, for any sign of what had been outside. The ground was disturbed, but not like an animal had been there. The leaves were scuffed in strange patterns, like someone had been standing in one place for a long time. That day, I kept my hunting knife close. I didn't go far from the cabin. The feeling of being watched never left me. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and stacked wood in front of it. I kept the knife next to me as I lay in bed, barely able to close my eyes. Sometime past midnight, it started again. The footsteps, the slow circling, then the tapping. But this time, it moved to the window. I didn't dare look. Then the door handle rattled. I gripped the knife, heart hammering. The chair held, but the rattling didn't stop. It was slow, methodical, like whoever was outside was testing it. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice. A low, slow exhale, right outside the door. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the window. Nothing, just trees. But the feeling didn't leave. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed up my things and threw them in the truck. I didn't care about the rental agreement. I didn't care about anything except getting out of there. As I pulled away, I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror. Just once. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the tree line, half hidden behind the trunk. Not an animal, not a shadow, person, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I drove until I hit the highway and didn't slow down until I saw other cars. I never went back. I never even contacted the rental owner. I don't care what was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when everything is quiet, I remember the tapping. And I wonder if somewhere out there, it's still waiting. I should have never gone up to that cabin alone. It wasn't even my idea. My buddy Mike had booked it for the both of us. Said he needed a break from city life. Then last minute he bailed. Family emergency. I should have just canceled. But I told myself a solo weekend in the mountains might do me some good. No distractions, no noise, just me and nature. The place was tucked deep into the woods. A good 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road. It was small, just one floor with a loft, the kind of cabin you'd see in an old hunting magazine. No electricity, no cell service. Just a wood stove, a few gas lamps, and a water pump out back. I had brought enough food for the weekend, along with a couple of books and my camping knife. I figured I'd chop some wood, sit by the fire, and maybe do some hiking during the day. Simple. The first night was uneventful. It took me a while to get the wood stove going, but once I had a fire, the place warmed up quickly. I made some canned chili on the propane burner and sat by the fire with my book. The silence was strange at first. I kept expecting to hear cars or distant voices, but there was nothing. Just the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It wasn't until I went to bed that I felt uneasy. The loft had a small window that looked out into the woods, and for some reason, I found myself staring at it longer than I should have. It felt like something was out there, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Too much time in the city, not used to the quiet. I forced myself to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized the fire had gone out, and the cabin was cold. Really cold. The kind of cold that settles in your bones. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and listened. There it was again. A sound. Not close, but not far either. A steady, deliberate crunching of snow. It was probably an animal. A deer, maybe. But something about the way the sound moved didn't sit right with me. It wasn't darting around like deer do. It was steady, slow. Purposeful. I held my breath, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stayed awake for another hour, listening. But the sound didn't come back, and eventually exhaustion won. The next morning, I stepped outside, half expecting to see tracks in the snow, but there was nothing, no sign of anything. I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe I had dreamed it. The day passed without incident. I hiked a little, chopped some firewood, and read. By the time the sun started setting, I was feeling more relaxed. I made dinner and sat by the fire again, convincing myself I was being ridiculous the night before. That night, I woke up again. This time, I knew what had woken me. The sound was back. Crunch, crunch, closer now. I sat up, heart pounding. My breath fogged in the cold air. I reached for my knife and held it tight. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and deliberate. Someone was out there. Then the sound stopped just like before. I waited, gripping the knife, straining my ears for any movement. Nothing. The silence was worse than the noise. I wanted to get up and check, but every instinct told me to stay still. So I did. Morning came and I forced myself outside. This time I found something. A single boot print near the tree line. Just one. No trail leading in or out. I felt sick. Someone had been there, watching. I packed my things. I didn't care that I had planned to stay another night. I threw my gear into the truck and started down the long dirt road. About 10 minutes in, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing just at the edge of the trees, was a figure. Just standing, watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I never told anyone about what happened. Never went back. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear those slow, deliberate footsteps. I was looking for a quiet place to clear my head, somewhere off-grid, where I wouldn't hear the hum of traffic or the constant pinging of my phone. I found a listing online for a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It wasn't a rental, it was for sale. The pictures showed a simple structure, weathered wood siding, a tin roof, a porch with an old rocking chair. It sat alone, surrounded by thick trees, with nothing but wilderness for miles. The owner wanted a quick sale, cash only. The price was suspiciously low. I should have asked why. The drive out there was long. The last 20 miles were on an old logging road, rough and barely maintained. My truck struggled over deep ruts and loose gravel. By the time I arrived, the sun was hanging low in the sky. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, worn but sturdy, nestled between tall pines. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I stepped onto the porch, testing the old wood beneath my boots. Creaked but held firm. The front door was unlocked, and when I pushed it open, a rush of stale air greeted me. Inside, the place was small. One main room with a wood stove, a kitchenette, and a single bed against the far wall. A door in the back led to a tiny bathroom. There was no electricity, just an old propane lantern on the table and a stack of firewood beside the stove. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. I found a yellowed envelope on the table with a single key inside and a short note scrawled in shaky handwriting. Lock the door at night, no matter what. I laughed a little, thinking it was just some local superstition. Maybe the previous owner wanted to keep animals out or was just paranoid. Either way, I took the advice. When the sun dipped below the trees, I locked the door and set up my sleeping bag on the bed. The silence pressed in on me. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals. Just silence. It was around midnight when I woke up. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps on the porch. My heart started pounding. I reached for the hunting knife I kept in my bag. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting. A minute passed. Then another. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but deep down I knew better. Animals don't move like that. They don't stop and listen like a person would. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening to the silence. The next morning, I stepped outside, half expecting to see footprints on the porch. There was nothing, just the undisturbed layer of dirt and pine needles. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I decided to stay another night. I told myself I wouldn't scare so easily this time. That evening, as the last light faded, I locked the door again. I sat at the small table, reading by lantern light, trying to distract myself. Hours passed. Then, just like the night before, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I gripped my knife, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped right outside the window next to the bed. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. And then something tapped on the glass. Not hard, just the soft, unmistakable sound of fingernails against the window pane. I bolted upright, heart hammering. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. My mind raced. Was it a person? If it was, why weren't they saying anything? Why weren't they trying to break in? I clenched the knife tighter. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the tapping stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the dark, waiting for morning. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded up my truck, I felt eyes on me, an unbearable weight pressing down. The trees were too still, the silence too deep. I didn't look back. As I pulled onto the old logging road, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a figure standing at the tree line, not moving, just watching. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It wasn't anything fancy, just a solo getaway in a small, off-grid cabin deep in the woods. I'd booked it through some rental site, one of those listings with minimal information but plenty of rustic charm. No cell service, no electricity, just a wood stove, a lantern, and a creek nearby for water. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky as I left the main highway and followed a winding dirt road into the forest. The trees thickened as I went, towering pines swallowing up the light, and soon I was the only vehicle for miles. The road was rougher than I expected, more potholes and loose gravel than solid ground, but my truck managed. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had nearly disappeared. It was smaller than I pictured, maybe the size of a large shed, with a sagging porch and a pile of firewood stacked beside the door. The listing said it had been built decades ago and hadn't changed much since. That was fine by me. I wanted to disconnect, to sit by the fire, to wake up to the sound of birds instead of alarms. Inside, it was bare bones. A cot pushed against the wall, a small table with a single chair, a cast iron stove in the corner, and a few shelves with mismatched dishes. A dusty lantern sat on the table, the only source of light now that the sun was gone. The silence hit me first. No hum of electricity, no distant highway noise, just the occasional creak of the trees outside and the wind moving through the branches. I unpacked quickly, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and got to work lighting a fire in the stove. The wood was dry, catching fast, and soon enough, warmth spread through the tiny space. I made myself a simple dinner, canned soup heated over the fire, then sat on the porch for a while, staring into the darkness. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their outlines barely visible against the deep black of the sky. That first night, I slept lightly, the kind of half-sleep where every noise jolts you awake. Branches snapped somewhere in the distance, probably just a deer moving through the brush. but it kept me on edge. More than once, I swore I heard something closer, a soft rustling right outside the cabin walls. But every time I held my breath and listened, the sound was gone. Just the wind, I told myself. Just the woods settling. Morning came slow. The sky was pale and cold, the fire in the stove long dead. I stepped outside to relieve myself and noticed something strange. The pile of firewood looked different. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but no. I'd stacked it neatly the night before, and now it was shifted. Some pieces had fallen over, others moved slightly out of place. An animal, maybe, a raccoon or something. I shrugged it off, made some instant coffee on the stove, and decided to explore a little. There was an old hiking trail behind the cabin, barely more than a narrow path cutting through the trees. It wasn't on any maps, but the listing had mentioned it. I followed it for about a mile, the silence pressing in the farther I went. That's when I saw it. A small, weathered boot lying just off the trail. It was half buried in the dirt, the leather cracked with age. Child-sized, I nudged it with my toe, turning it slightly. Empty. No footprints around it, no sign of a camp or anything nearby. Just a single boot, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. A strange unease settled in my stomach, but I told myself it had probably been here for years. Some kid lost it hiking with their family. Still, it stuck with me as I made my way back to the cabin. The day passed uneventfully. I read for a while, took a nap, chopped some more firewood. By evening, I was starting to relax, convincing myself I'd just been overthinking things. Then, just after sunset, I noticed something else. The boot. It was on the porch. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. I hadn't brought it back. I knew I hadn't. I'd left it on the trail, a mile away. I scanned the woods, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the endless dark stretching between them. Something wasn't right. I went inside, locked the door, and kept the fire going high. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside made me flinch. More than once, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate crunches in the leaves. But when I looked out the window, the forest was still. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. I woke up to the door creaking open. Not all the way, just an inch, maybe two. Enough to send a thin sliver of moonlight cutting across the floor. I sat up fast, my breath stuck in my throat. The door had been locked. I was sure of it. I grabbed the lantern, my hands shaking, and stepped toward the door. The fire had burned low, the cabin almost completely dark. I reached out, heart pounding, and pushed the door shut. The lock clicked back into place, but I didn't feel any better. I barely slept the rest of the night, listening to every shift of the wind, every crack of the trees. I wanted to believe it had been the wind, that the door had never latched properly. But deep down, I knew better. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sky lightened, I packed my things. I didn't even eat breakfast, just stuffed everything in my bag, doused the fire, and stepped onto the porch. The boot was gone. Not where I'd last seen it, not anywhere nearby. Just gone. I didn't hesitate. I got in my truck and started the engine, the sound shattering the morning quiet. I didn't look back as I pulled away, didn't stop until I hit the main road again. I never reported it. What would I even say? That a boot moved on its own? That my locked door opened in the night? That I felt something out there watching? I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't think I ever want to. But I do know one thing: I won't be going back. The drive up to the cabin took longer than expected. The old dirt road twisted through the woods, narrow and uneven, and my tires struggled against deep potholes. The sun had already dipped below the trees, leaving only a sliver of dim light on the horizon. I glanced at the time, 6:47 p.m. I had hoped to be there before dark, but I wasn't too far off. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He had passed away a few months back, and since then, no one had stepped foot in the place. My family was in the process of selling it, but someone needed to check in, make sure everything was in order, and pick up a few personal items my uncle had left behind. I volunteered, thinking a weekend away in the woods would be peaceful, a break from the constant hum of life. I finally spotted the cabin through the trees, barely visible in the fading light. It was small, one-story, made of dark, weathered wood. A single porch light flickered on, connected to a motion sensor. I parked the truck, cut the engine, and stepped out. The air was cold and still. No wind, no rustling branches, no chirping insects, just silence. I grabbed my bag and the supplies I brought: flashlights, extra batteries, some canned food, and a few bottles of water. My uncle hadn't kept the place stocked, and I didn't plan on staying long, just overnight. I climbed the creaky steps to the porch and reached for the key under the old iron lantern nailed to the wall. The lock turned with some resistance, but I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scent of dust and old wood filled my nose. The cabin was just as I remembered, small, cramped, but cozy. A single couch in the living room, an old wooden coffee table, a stone fireplace with a stack of logs beside it. The kitchen was a few steps away, nothing but a stove, a tiny fridge, and a wooden dining table pushed against the wall. To the left was the hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. I set my bag down and clicked on a flashlight. The power was supposed to work, but I didn't want to rely on it. The last thing I needed was to be stranded in the dark. I checked the kitchen first. The fridge was empty, unplugged. The cabinets held a few old cans of soup and some stale crackers. Nothing I'd touch. The bedroom was next. My uncle's bed was still made, a thin layer of dust covering the blankets. A single dresser stood against the far wall, the top covered in papers and small trinkets. I'd go through them in the morning. The bathroom was normal. Nothing unusual, just an old mirror, a shower, a toilet. But when I turned to leave, something made me stop. The window. It was unlocked. I knew for a fact my uncle always locked his windows. He was paranoid about it, especially when he stayed here alone. But this one, the only window facing the back of the cabin, was cracked open. Not much, just an inch or two, but enough. I shut it, locked it, and stood there for a moment, listening. The woods outside were still silent. No wind, no movement. I shook it off. Maybe someone had come up before me, checked things out, and forgot to lock it. I stepped back into the main room and tossed a few logs into the fireplace. The flames flickered to life, crackling softly. I sat down on the couch, pulled out my phone, and checked the signal. No bars. Not surprising. The reception up here was awful. I turned on my flashlight and looked through the papers on the coffee table. Old letters, receipts, a few photographs of my uncle fishing by the lake. Normal stuff. The fire warmed the small space, and my eyelids grew heavy. The long drive had drained me. I glanced at my watch. 9:23 p.m. I figured I'd get some sleep, wake up early, and head out before noon. I left the fire burning low and went to the bedroom. I didn't bother changing, just kicked off my boots and lay on top of the blankets. The cabin creaked every now and then, the old wood settling, but otherwise it was quiet. I closed my eyes. Then, around 2 a.m., something woke me up, a sound. I lay still, holding my breath. It was faint, barely there, but I heard it. A soft, slow creak, like weight shifting on an old wooden floor. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The room was empty. The door was still closed. I listened, my pulse heavy in my ears. Nothing. I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed, keeping the light aimed at the doorway. My boots were still on the floor where I left them. My bag was untouched. Then I heard it again. From the living room, slow, careful footsteps. I grabbed the knife from my bag and stood up, my heart pounding. I had locked the door. I was sure of it. The windows, too. No one should be in here. I moved toward the door, turned the handle slowly, and pushed it open. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping over the small space. The front door was wide open. The fire had burned low, casting shadows that flickered along the walls. A gust of cold air slipped inside. My pulse hammered as I stepped forward, scanning the room. Nothing was out of place, but someone had been here. I walked to the door, shining the light outside. The porch was empty. The truck was still there. The woods beyond were pitch black, impossible to see through. I locked the door, checked the windows again, and stood there, listening. Nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the couch with the fire stoked back up, knife in my hand, watching the door. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed my bag and left. I didn't bother checking the bedroom again, didn't take any of my uncle's things. I just got in my truck and started the engine. I didn't relax until I hit the main road, miles from the cabin. I never told my family what happened, just said I didn't find anything important and left it at that. A few months later, the property was sold. A young couple bought it. I never met them, but I heard they planned to fix it up, use it as a vacation home. A year later, I saw a news article. A break-in, same cabin. The couple wasn't home at the time, but someone had forced their way inside. Nothing was stolen, but the back window was unlocked. And the only thing the intruder left behind was a single muddy footprint in the middle of the living room floor. I took the trip alone because I needed space. That's what I told myself. Work was getting to me, life was getting to me. I wanted to get away from everything and everyone. So I rented a cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't one of those fancy vacation rentals with a hot tub and Wi-Fi. It was old, small, and barely had electricity. The kind of place you'd find on a hunting trip, not a weekend getaway. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long. I had to take back roads most of the way, and by the time I got close, my GPS lost signal. I had to follow written directions, which felt strange in a world where I relied on my phone for everything. I passed a couple of old houses, some trailers, and then nothing but trees. Eventually, I reached the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. It was rough, full of potholes and overgrown on both sides. Branches scraped the sides of my car as I drove through. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already starting to set. It looked exactly like the photos, small, wooden, dark brown from years of weathering. There was a front porch with an old rocking chair and a single window on the front wall. The trees were thick all around it, so much that I could barely see the sky. The air was still heavy. It was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that made you notice how alone you really were. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The door was stiff and creaked when I pushed it open. The inside smelled like wood, dust, and something stale, like old fabric that had been left sitting too long. The main room had a couch, a small wooden table, and a fireplace. There was a kitchen area in the back, with an old stove and a fridge that I doubted worked. To the left, a doorway led to the bedroom. The bed had a thin mattress and an old quilt folded at the foot. I checked my phone, no service. No surprise there. I told myself it was fine, that I wanted to disconnect. I unpacked, ate a granola bar since I wasn't about to mess with that stove, and sat on the porch for a while. The woods stretched out in every direction. Felt like the world ended out here. By the time it got dark, I was exhausted. I went inside, locked the door, and got into bed. The mattress was stiff, the blanket smelled musty, but I was too tired to care. I closed my eyes and listened. The silence wasn't as deep as before. Now there were sounds, the creaking of the cabin settling, the rustling of leaves outside, the occasional snap of a twig. Somewhere in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a slow wake-up, not the kind where you drift in and out of sleep. 1 second I was asleep, the next I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound came from outside, near the front of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal moving through the brush. It was steady, deliberate, like something dragging along the wooden porch. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just the woods, just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I turned on my side and faced the wall, pulling the blanket tighter around me. A minute passed, maybe 2. Then I heard it again. This time it was closer. A slow, scraping sound, moving toward the window. I swallowed hard and stayed still. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud I was sure whoever, or whatever, was outside could hear it. Then silence. Minutes passed, but I didn't dare move. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear anything walking away, just silence. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually exhaustion won. I fell asleep, or maybe I passed out from fear. When I woke up, the sun was coming through the window. I sat up and listened. Nothing, just the normal morning sounds. The wind through the trees, the chirping of birds. I got up, hesitated, then forced myself to check the porch. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was just my imagination. But when I opened the door, I saw it. Scratch marks, deep ones, running along the wooden boards of the porch, right in front of the door. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't animal scratches. They were long, uneven, like someone had taken something sharp and dragged it along the wood. I checked around the cabin. No tracks, no signs of anyone being there. Just those marks. I told myself it had to be something natural, something explainable. I tried to enjoy the day, went for a short walk, read a book on the porch, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I locked the door and moved a chair in front of it. Felt stupid, but I did it anyway. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise made me jump. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Scraping. Slow, steady, right outside the door. I sat up, frozen, barely breathing. Then I heard something else. A soft tap. Knuckles. Tapping. 3 times. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at the door. Then silence. I sat like that for hours until the sun started coming up. When I finally worked up the nerve, I moved the chair and opened the door. The porch was empty. The scratches were deeper now, longer. I grabbed my stuff, threw it in my bag, and got in my car. The engine felt painfully slow to start, but when it finally did, I backed out of there fast. I didn't look back. By the time I got to the main road, my phone had service again. I pulled over and checked the cabin listing. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone had left a review mentioning something strange. But the listing was gone. I pulled off the main road onto a winding dirt path, barely wide enough for my truck. The trees were thick on both sides, their bare branches scraping against my side mirrors as I crawled forward. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a mile off the highway. It had been my uncle's hunting retreat before he passed, and now it was mine. I hadn't been here in years, but I needed a place to clear my head. Work had been draining, and my personal life wasn't much better. A few days alone sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin itself was simple. 1 story, a small front porch, and a tin roof that echoed every raindrop. The wood siding was graying, the front door stiff from years of neglect. I shouldered it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, dust coated everything. A couch sat in the center of the main room, the fabric worn and sun-bleached. Against the far wall was a wood stove, and to the left, a tiny kitchen with an old gas stove and a small fridge that probably didn't work anymore. A door in the back led to a single bedroom and an even smaller bathroom. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. I ignored it, dropping my bag by the couch and setting out to make the place livable. I opened the windows to air it out, checked the water pump, and made sure the propane tank for the stove was still functional. It was barely. The kitchen faucet sputtered before water finally flowed, murky at first but clearing after a few seconds. The electricity, thankfully, was still connected. I spent the next hour unpacking. I had enough food to last the weekend: canned soup, some dried goods, and a few bottles of water. The nights would be cold, but there was plenty of chopped wood stacked against the back wall outside. I got a fire going in the wood stove and settled in for the night, flipping through an old magazine I'd found in the cabin. The first night was uneventful, except for the constant creaking of the trees outside. I'd forgotten how loud the woods could be at night. The wind whistled through the branches, sending leaves skittering across the roof. Every now and then, a thump sounded from outside, probably a pine cone or a branch falling. I convinced myself it was nothing. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore. The land around the cabin stretched for miles, mostly untouched. My uncle used to talk about an old hunting trail that led deeper into the woods, and I wanted to find it. The air was crisp as I stepped outside, my boots crunching against frost-covered leaves. I took my time, marking trees with a small knife so I wouldn't lose my way. About an hour in, I stumbled upon something strange. It was an old campsite, abandoned long ago. The fire pit was surrounded by scattered beer cans and a few rusted cooking pots. A collapsed tent lay nearby, the fabric torn and covered in moss. It looked like no one had been here in years. I felt an unease settle in my chest, but I brushed it off. People camped in the woods all the time. Maybe they left in a hurry. Maybe a storm forced them out. I turned back toward the cabin, but something stopped me. A smell. It was faint but sharp, carried on the wind. Something rotting. I scanned the trees, but nothing looked out of place. Maybe an animal had died nearby. I shook off the feeling and made my way back, carving another mark into a tree as I went. That night, the noises outside felt different. The usual creaks and rustling were there, but something else mixed in. Something heavier. Footsteps? I sat up in bed, listening, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon rummaging near the cabin. Still, I locked the door and made sure my hunting knife was within reach before trying to sleep. I woke up to a noise on the porch. It was soft at first, a slow creak, like someone shifting their weight. My heart pounded as I sat up. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the wooden walls. I stayed still, listening. The wind had picked up outside, but beneath it, I heard it again, a slow, deliberate step. Someone was out there. I moved quietly, slipping out of bed and grabbing my knife. I debated turning on the porch light, but decided against it. If someone was watching, I didn't want to give away my position. Instead, I crept toward the window and peered out. Nothing. The porch was empty. The old rocking chair sat motionless. The firewood pile was undisturbed, but something felt off. I held my breath, waiting. The woods beyond the porch were pitch black, the trees swaying in the wind. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then movement. A shadow shifted at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Too tall to be an animal, too still to be the wind. I gripped the knife tighter, every muscle in my body tensed. And then it was gone. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, every creak and rustle setting my nerves on edge. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, scanning the ground for any sign that someone had been there. The dirt on the porch was undisturbed, but as I walked toward the tree line, my stomach dropped. Footprints, not boots, not sneakers, bare feet. The prints were deep, leading from the trees toward the cabin, then stopping just before the porch steps. Like whoever it was had stood there, watching. I packed my things immediately. I didn't care if I had planned to stay another night. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't about to wait and find out what. I threw my bag into the truck, started the engine, and backed out onto the dirt path. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my eyes darting to the tree line. As I reached the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a second, just a second, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the woods, tall, motionless. Then the road curved, and the cabin disappeared from sight. I never went back.